Good morning and welcome to our program today, Genocide and the Ongoing Persecution of Rohingya Muslims. Earlier this year, the US government declared Myanmar's mass killing of the Rohingya Muslim population to be a genocide. This designation comes 6 years after the first incidents of mass violence was carried out by Myanmar's military against the long persecuted and marginalized community. Today, we're delighted to have a program with two people in particular who have made a major, engaged in a major concern with regard to what has been going on in Myanmar. Dr. Ronan Lee is a doctoral prize fellow at Loughborough University, London's Institute for Media and Creative Industries. His research focuses on the Rohingya genocide, hate speech, migration, and Asian politics. He's the author of Myanmar, Rohingya Genocide, Identity, History, and Hate Speech. Our discussant is Abdul Malik Mujahid. He is an imam in Chicago. He's the founder president of Sound Vision and Justice for All and the Muslim Network TV. As producer, his documentaries are shown on 64 channels across the globe. He serves as the chair of the Burma Task Force, a coalition of 15 national and regional organizations against genocide in Burma. So now, Dr. Lee, I'll turn the program over to you.
Well, look, thank you so much. It's great to be with you. And I want to thank the Bridge Initiative for hosting this. I mean, it's I think crucially important with so many issues that can distract going on in the world, that we continue to remember that the Rohingya are today still victims of shocking crimes within Myanmar, and most Rohingya live as refugees away from their ancestral homelands. They're living in refugee camps within Bangladesh. I would acknowledge that most people will know the Rohingya community very much in a crisis context. And there's a group that came to international prominence in 2017 during what was the largest forced migration that that region had seen since really the Second World War. Over 700,000 Rohingya civilians forced across the international frontier from Myanmar into Bangladesh. But I want to take us back a little bit further. I want to take us to 2015. And I want to talk just briefly about my visit to the Ong Mingla community in Rakhine State's capital, where in Rakhine State is the ancestral home of the Rohingya. It's in Western Myanmar. It's adjacent, shares a border with Bangladesh at the north of the Bay of Bengal. And within Sittwe, the state capital, in the center of town, the very middle of that urban center, is a community called Ong Mingla. It's traditionally been a Rohingya community. When I visited in 2015, it would have been home to between 4,000 and 5,000 Rohingya. But what was unusual about their situation in 2015 was that this was a community completely locked down. They were trapped within what really was a ghetto. It was a place where Rohingya couldn't freely leave. People couldn't freely enter. You needed permission from the state authorities to be able to enter. And Rohingya had been trapped there since 2012. So there was no industry, there was no agriculture. This was an urban ghetto where the inhabitants, all Rohingya, were utterly reliant upon the good graces of the government that had forced them into this situation. So this was a community that lived with the daily fear that the authorities would at any time prevent them from accessing food, water. They were already prevented from accessing medical care. So the Sittwe hospital was just a few hundred meters away. The Sittwe main market was also a few hundred meters away, but these are places that Rohingya in Ong Mingla were not allowed to go to without seeking permission from the authorities. Now, the market was something they could never go to. and Rohingya businesses that had operated in that market previously had been closed. They'd been locked. The Rohingya had been obviously sent away, but you could see anti-Rohingya graffiti. I mean, this is reminiscent of the worst of what we saw during the Second World War. Anti-Rohingya graffiti on former Rohingya businesses that had been shut. In terms of their access to healthcare, that was something they couldn't freely do. If a resident of Ongmingla got seriously ill, they could seek permission from the authorities. It could take days. Often, by the time that those permissions came, the individual was beyond assistance, or the condition was much more worse than it needed to, much more serious than it needed to be. This was a shocking place. It was a place where the community relied entirely on remittances from the diaspora, and they lived in constant fear for their lives and for the lives of their family members. This was this visit that convinced me beyond all doubt that what we were seeing in Myanmar at that time was very much a genocide. No question about it in my mind. From that point onward, there could be no excuse. There could be no misapprehension about what we were seeing within Myanmar. This was a deliberate attempt by the Myanmar authorities, both military and civilian, to destroy this group, to destroy the Rohingya community. And the Rohingya in Ongmingla were right to be concerned. They were right to be fearful for their lives, because it was just 2 years later that the vast majority of Rohingya were forced out of, away from their ancestral homeland and forced out of Myanmar in a shockingly violent genocidal deportation. I mean, described at the time by UN figures as a humanitarian nightmare. I mean, it was undoubtedly a humanitarian catastrophe. It was the deportation that prompted, of course, the United States recently to make a genocide declaration. It was the events associated with 2017 that I think really brought that to fruition. It's the cause of an investigation currently by the International Criminal Court, and they're investigating on the basis of the crime of deportation and other atrocity crimes obviously associated with that. And of course, it's the basis of the Gambia's case at the International Court of Justice that Myanmar has not lived up to its responsibilities to prevent genocide occurring on its territory. Of course, the mistreatment of the Rohingya in 2017 is not new. I mean, it was new, I think, to many international observers, on the basis that the Myanmar authorities had so actively worked to prevent access to Rakhine State, to prevent access to the places that the Rohingya were, so that people couldn't readily hear their stories. It was difficult for journalists to go to the places where the Rohingya were. It was difficult for policymakers. It was difficult for very difficult for foreigners to get to Rakhine State. You could at times travel there and then find that you couldn't leave Sittwe to do anything really. You could visit what were approved tourist locations, but you would need permission from the authorities to talk to ordinary people, and Rohingya communities were generally off limits. In terms of the mistreatment that the Rohingya received in 2017 is very much reminiscent of what had been done to them previously. So in 1991-92, there'd similarly been a military-led forced deportation of hundreds of thousands of Rohingya into Bangladesh, and similarly during the 1970s. It was a pattern from the 1970s onwards that saw every decade or so hundreds of thousands of Rohingya forcibly deported from Myanmar. But during 2017, though, I think what captivated many international observers was this question around Aung San Suu Kyi's role as the civilian leader of Myanmar at that time. And I'm sure we'll talk about the role of Aung San Suu Kyi, but I just want to talk about what was presented in 2017 often as the challenge that was faced by Aung San Suu Kyi. It was presented quite commonly as a question for her as to whether or not she would align with the views of the Myanmar military, which were presented as being the views of the majority of people in Myanmar. It was presented that Myanmar's majority were anti-Rohingya, and that in a competitive electoral context, Aung San Suu Kyi, as a civilian politician, wanted to align herself with the views of the majority and not align herself with support for the human rights of the Rohingya community. And I think that this was allowed to become it was a narrative that really took off. It was an excuse, I think, that was provided to Aung San Suu Kyi and to the National League for Democracy. But it was a false question because, and this was a frustration that was raised with me at the time by some journalists, diplomats, and other people involved in scholarship on Myanmar, that really it wasn't a question between the civilian authorities supporting the Rohingya wholesale or opposing their rights wholesale. There was an opportunity for Aung San Suu Kyi as the civilian leader of the country to call for moderation on the part of the military. The deportation of Rohingya in 2017 happened very quickly, but it didn't happen instantaneously. It happened over a period of weeks. In fact, it continued for some months. People were continuing to cross the border into Bangladesh some months on as their circumstances deteriorated within Myanmar. Had Aung San Suu Kyi early decided to call upon the military to restrain themselves, which I think would have achieved international support, certainly from the West, that would have been a position that would have been supported by Western leaders. But I think there were many within Myanmar who were hoping that at some point she would call upon the military to restrain themselves, that she would call upon the military to not be as brutal to civilians within the country. And that was an opportunity lost, I think, for Aung San Suu Kyi and the National League for Democracy. Instead, what she chose to do was throw her lot in with the military, describing, of course, examples of military atrocities, casting doubt upon the veracity of accounts of military atrocities. In fact, doing that with every platform that was available to her. I think it was an opportunity lost in the sense that had she called upon the military for restraint, and had they at that time launched a coup against her and the National League for Democracy administration, I think we would have seen a very different international response and a much more immediate international response than we saw in response to the coup in 2021. So in many ways, it's a lost opportunity, of course, for the Rohingya community, but also a lost opportunity for those within Myanmar who wanted the military to be restrained and who ultimately wanted the military to be removed from politics in that country. I'll talk a little bit about just the background to why the Rohingya are in the situation that they're in and why it wasn't always like this for them. Myanmar, as we know, is an overwhelmingly Buddhist country. In the most recent surveys, 87%, I mean, close to 90% of the country declared that they were adherents of Theravada Buddhism. There's a country of 51 million people. There's a Christian minority as well, just over 6%, and a small Muslim community, just over 4% in the figures. And prior to 2017, half of that number would have been the Rohingya community within Rakhine State. And there would, prior to 2017, have been approximately 1.4 million Rohingya living within Rakhine State on what has been their ancestral lands. The history of the region, of course, is that Rakhine State, still often known as Arakan by many people, and you talk to people even within Rakhine State contemporary times, and they'll call their area Arakan. Arakan was an independent kingdom, the trading kingdom at the north of the Bay of Bengal. It was well known to the outside world until the 1780s, 1784, when it was invaded by the Burmese Empire. So prior to 1784, Arakan was an independent trading polity. It was predominantly, it was both Buddhist and Muslim. At various times, Arakan claimed to certainly claimed the adherence of leaders as far south, of course, as the Arakan Yoma mountain range within Myanmar, but as far north almost as Chittagong. And at times, Arakan over the last 1,000 years would have had a Muslim majority. So it was a multi-ethnic polity, but it wasn't one where religion was the primary marker for people. It's noteworthy that when at the time that Arakan was finally invaded by the Burmese in 1784, that at that time the court language was Persian. And there were documents at that time sent from the Arakanese court to the British in Persian. I mean, this was a community that traded with the outside world, at times minted coins that included the kalima, the Islamic declaration of faith. At times also the kings of Arakan took on Muslim titles. So this was certainly a place where the Rohingya's ancestors would have felt very comfortable historically. The situation changed, of course, when the Burmese invaded. That brought the Burmese into immediate contact with the East India Company and the British administration in India. Ultimately, there was a series of wars between the Burmese and the British. The British were successful in those wars, and that's what began the colonial period in Burma's colonial period. So prior to colonial rule, Arakan had been part of Myanmar, Burma, for less than 40 years, and still maintained. There is still certainly even today the Buddhist community of Arakan are still politically quite separatist. They regard themselves as not necessarily a full part of the Myanmar state, and there are strong claims for independence and certainly separatism, and certainly a type of federalism that would give the local community much more control of local resources. Now, the Rohingya's history has not quite gone in that way. The Rohingya's history has been that since Burma gained independence in 1948, they've been very loyal. Astonishingly loyal, really, to Burma, to Myanmar. Throughout the colonial period, certainly there were changes to the demographics of Myanmar. Politically, the British unquestionably privileged administrators and others that they'd brought from the Indian subcontinent. That created certainly tensions with in what we would call Burma proper, so Yangon or Rangoon and Mandalay and those sorts of places. There's often talk about the Rohingya being presented as colonial era arrivals. The demographics just, I don't think, play that out at all. That in actual fact, the proportion of Muslims in Arakan at the time the British arrived is pretty much the same proportion that were living there at Burmese independence and living there in 2017. About a third of the state being Muslim. However, the colonial era and the colonial experience in Burma certainly created an animosity within the country towards foreigners, an animosity towards anyone who had who was perceived to have benefited from foreign from the colonial experience. In 1948, when Burma became independent, the Rohingya, of course, were a full part of the political fabric of the country. And here's where things, I think, here's where we start to see things begin to change, but they'll change significantly once the military takes power in 1962. So in 1948, you had Rohingya serving in parliament, you had Rohingya serving in frontbench government roles, you could hear the Rohingya language on the national radio service. You had prominent Rohingya student organizations at Rangoon University. I think it's worth just reading a statement from UNU. UNU is what was the actually the Prime Minister of Burma throughout the early independence period, and in fact is the longest serving Prime Minister or national head of government still. And his statement what was this: the people living in Mongda and Buridong, I mean these are the Rohingya communities nearest to the Bangladesh frontier. The people living in Mongda and Buridong regions are our nationals, our brethren. They're called Rohingyas. They are one of the same power and status of nationality with Kachin, Kayar, Karen, Mon, Rakhine, and Shan. They're one of the ethnic races of Burma. And it's a pretty clear statement from the civilian political leader of the country that the Rohingya were and should be regarded as a full part of the national political fabric. But that all started to break down in 1962 with the military coup. And this is the same military, of course, that is in power, that has undertaken the most recent coup in Myanmar. The leaders of the military coup, in particular Ne Win, the dictator, were shockingly xenophobic. One of the first significant acts of Ne Win was to nationalize those industries that were owned by what he perceived to be foreigners, so people of Indian or Chinese origin primarily. This occurred during the 1960s. There were large-scale expulsions. I mean, hundreds of thousands of Chinese and Indian people of Chinese and Indian origin, many of them had been living in Burma for generations, expelled from the country during the 1960s. Now, the Rohingya weren't expelled at that time. And I think the Rohingya weren't expelled from the country at that time, not because the Myanmar military didn't want to expel them, but because it would have been too difficult to do so. There were challenges in terms of the stability of the border regions, and the central military administration was struggling to control the border regions. The Rohingya were also a well-integrated part of their community. They had recently had representatives in parliament. It would have been very difficult, I think, at that time to expel them. What the military administration did, though, is it started a process of weaponizing history and of rewriting the history of the country and of presenting people who were not Buddhist as legitimately as second-class citizens, that they were not to be trusted, that they were not to be really part of that they were not a real part of the national political fabric. I mean, it was described by scholars as a process of Burmanization. That the Bamar group is the largest ethnicity within Myanmar. It's primarily, it's almost 100% Buddhist community. And in this context, it's important to acknowledge that people within Myanmar often see religion and ethnicity as just hand in hand, as the same thing, that it would be very difficult for many to conceive of a person to be Bamar and not Buddhist. So for the military administration, the process of Burmanization. So this is the process of homogenizing the country along ethnic lines, was also a process of homogenizing the country along religious lines. And one of the ways that they did that was by, over time, changing attitudes towards citizenship and ultimately changing the citizenship laws of the country, which they did in 1982. And they created, in the period post-1982, a list of groups that are considered Tayinta national races within Myanmar. People who are regarded as, I guess a good description would be indigenous. It's a concept similar to indigeneity, not quite the same, but very similar to indigeneity. And in time, they issued a list of who would be considered a national race, who would be considered indigenous. And of course, by the time that list was published in the 1990s, the Rohingya had been separated from the rest of the country through various policies of exclusion for some decades. And those policies included limits on the Rohingyas' access to education, preventing Rohingya from traveling outside of their communities. So by 1990, you had a situation where most people within Myanmar would not have had, may not have had any experience of meeting with a Rohingya person. And certainly Rohingya would have been encouraged not to declare that they were Rohingya. If they were living in Yangon, in Rangoon, as it then was, they would have been encouraged not to declare themselves as Rohingya, because it would have affected their ability to access other rights within, for the children, in terms of education, or maybe access to healthcare, or if they were trying to, even access to jobs would have been an issue. So by the time the military activated its policies on the Rohingya, we have a situation where many people in the country genuinely do see the Rohingya as not quite one of them, as people who are separate. And one of the ways that the military weaponized this situation was that it then started to aggressively undertake verifications of identity in Rohingya communities. I mean, these were these euphemisms really for campaigns to drive the Rohingya out of Myanmar. So very, very similar to what we, in practice, very similar to what we saw in 2017, where the military undertakes actions against civilians. The immediate effect is that there's panic among the civilian community, and people flee, and Rohingya flee the country. And they flee with very similar accounts to the accounts that we saw in 2017, widespread extrajudicial killings, sexual violence as a routine military tool, and the destruction of Rohingya homes and communities with fire. And that occurred consistently from the 1970s to the Rohingya. So that takes us really to the modern era, and to a situation where you have a Rohingya community that was a full part of the Arakan Kingdom, a Rohingya community that was a full part of political life throughout the colonial period and in the post-colonial independence period, but that begins to change significantly when the military comes to power in 1962. And then there is some assumption that as the military supposedly is relinquishing some power in the modern era, so with the Constitution of 2008, the military written Constitution of 2008, and a process that appeared to be a movement towards democracy with elections in 2010 and 2015 and 2020, that maybe there are some opportunities for the Rohingya in with the reemergence of a civilian political culture. Well, that wasn't to be the case at all. Ultimately, what occurred is that the Rohingya's role in society was the Rohingya were weaponized as a tool by Buddhist nationalists who used the Rohingya as, frankly, to win votes, to create a moral panic around the rise of a perceived threat to Islam, a perceived threat of Islam to the Buddhist character of Myanmar. And this emerged very much in the modern civilian era, or quasi-civilian era. When the military had full control of Myanmar, they prioritized stability, and they didn't want nationalists or Buddhist monks actively stoking religious tensions unless it suited them at any particular time, and then the military would very much direct that in the way that they wanted. That was their approach. When they stepped away slightly from politics and they let civilians participate in the political process from 2010, those pressures were left in the hands of civilian leaders, and they didn't repress freedom of expression in the same way. The problem, an associated thing that created a significant problem, was that Myanmar went from a situation where it had 50 years of military rule with no free press, with no access to the internet, to mobile phones. I mean, it's hard to believe that in 2010 there really was no access to the internet within Myanmar. It was available to some foreign, dial-up internet would have been available to some foreigners. Mobile phone SIM cards would have cost thousands of dollars. I mean, this was in a country at the time where the average household income was about $300 per annum. So the idea that any ordinary person could pay thousands of dollars even for a SIM card was laughable. That changed almost overnight. So by 2012, you could buy a SIM card in Myanmar for $1. And companies like Facebook arrived on the scene. And Facebook saw Myanmar as a place where it could gain market share. It rolled out its Free Basics program, which is a kind of an unmetered internet service on your phone, but you can only access sites determined by Facebook. You can access Facebook, and you could access news sites determined by Facebook. The consequence of that was that very quickly Facebook became the predominant way that people gained access to news, and that people communicated online. And that gave an opportunity to nationalists and aggressive Buddhist nationalist monks in particular to weaponize the platform and to target groups like the Rohingya. I am conscious that I want to leave time in this presentation for some questions. So I just want to I talk about very quickly about one nationalist figure that is one nationalist religious figure in Myanmar that is worth noting. A Buddhist monk called Waratu. Waratu became what you might call an influencer. I mean, this is even in the days before we talked of influencers. Waratu jumped onto Facebook as a platform. He's incredibly anti-Muslim. He's very anti-Rohingya, of course. You can search online for the sorts of things that he was circulating online, but his message was that Islam posed an existential threat to Buddhism, to the Buddhist character of Myanmar, and that consequently it was a religious duty to stomp on Muslims politically whenever the opportunity arose, and that was something that he and his followers very actively did, and encouraged governments to follow suit, and created the political environment where figures like Aung San Suu Kyi believed that there was a national political consensus that was anti-Muslim, and certainly that was anti-Rohingya. I'll just finish with this, saying that the sorts of narratives that Waratu presented were ones where, despite Buddhists in Myanmar being the overwhelming majority of the population, and it being laughable that there be any threat to the political power of Buddhists within Myanmar, he presented the Buddhist community as the victims of a potential threat from Islam, and he pointed to other countries that had historically had Buddhist majorities in the region, but were now majority Muslim, and presented a situation where it was a duty to support religious laws and racial laws that diminish the rights of Muslims. These are very similar. It was very similar language to what we've seen with some of the great replacement narratives that we see in the US. And it's, I think, no surprise that Waratu, in fact, compared himself to Donald Trump. And he basically described himself as, in fact, what he said was, a direct quote from Waratu was, the world singled us out as narrow-minded, but as people from the country that is the grandfather of democracy and human rights elected Donald Trump, who is similar to me in prioritizing nationalism, there would be less finger pointing from the international community. So his view was, Waratu's view was very much that he was following a narrative that was been laid out by figures like Trump. And the ultimate outcome here was that what we saw was a Rohingya Muslim community transitioned from being a full part of the national political fabric to excluded from the national political fabric to being victims of genocide. And that occurred in the space of decades. And that should worry us, not just about what's happened in Myanmar and not just about the experience of the Rohingya, but that should send us a very strong message that if it can happen there, it can happen where we are too. And I'll finish there.
Thank you very much for that presentation and for the information. And now we'll turn to Imam Malik Mujahid, who's been very active with the Burma Task Force and on many fronts.
Well, thank you so much, John. Thank you, Professor Lee, for extraordinary good presentation and your thought. I appreciate your work, and I think it informs our audience substantially. I agree with Dr. Lee that definitely, but the term I will use, there was apartheid before genocide. I have interviewed Rohingya survivor of genocide extensively. As a matter of fact, some of our interviews are submitted to International Criminal Court, and it also constitutes basis of case in ICJ with whom we have collaborated. Citizenship of Rohingyas were taken away in 2012, and that's where apartheid became legalized. They cannot travel freely. They need a permit to travel and multiple permit. Every household will be forced to take their hijabs. You know, Rohingyas are very religious people, and dress in front of, in Burmese dress in front of their houses. Annual photos will be taken of them. They cannot enter a school since 2012, while all Burmese can, and Rakhine people can also get into school. And Tuli, I learned another thing as I was watching in 2017, refugees coming in from Burma in front of me. Among the very few positions, they will have small cellular, you know, what you call a panel for cellular energy. And I wonder what it is for. And it turned out the electricity was there throughout Rakhine. In this same village, they will not allow electricity to Rohingya people while Burmese population will have electricity. So they are enterprising people. They will have small cell phone and they control that illegal market of not cell phone, the what they call cellular panels. So apartheid before genocide, and they were free to live wherever they want, while Rohingyas had designated place, including since 2012 detention camps. About 450,000 Rohingyas, most of them are still in detention camps of Burma, those who could not flee to Bangladesh because they were already in detention camp. Second point I will say is that its connection with Islamophobia in general. Things which Rohingyas will be accused of are similar things which Uyghurs are accused of, or Muslims in general are accused of, or now in Bangladesh, in India, Muslims are accused of. Muslims are terrorists. We are fighting extremism. Mind you, Rohingyas are indigenous people living in their ancestral land. Unlike Kachin people of Burma, who are fighting with guns, have liberated areas and relatively safe from Rohingyas, from Burmese military. Karen people fighting with guns, have in their areas, protecting their people. Rohingyas decided to follow a path of peaceful coexistence, as Professor Lee pointed out. Unfortunately, they are the one being called terrorists. They don't call Kachin terrorists. They don't call Karen terrorists. They don't call Chin people terrorists, but Rohingyas are called terrorists because that sells in the marketplace of Islamophobia. So Rohingyas are fighting, Burmese are fighting extremism. Say the same thing to Rohingyas in the Central African Republic. They wiped out all Muslims there, all 450 mosques gone except 2. Same thing is told of Uyghurs in China and now Muslims in India. Muslims are foreigners, despite the fact they are indigenous people living in their ancestral land. Another scholar, actually British scholar, thinks that they were in that land before even Burmese came, Burman race of Burma came into what is Burma now. Well, that's the historical research. They also are called Muslim are taken over the country, and Professor Lee told us they are more or less the same population and proportion. And they multiply too fast, of course, despite their population is the same, and they have been subject to multiple waves of genocide and expulsion. With that, I will come to current situation. Rohingyas, majority of them are now in Bangladesh. A good number of them, waves of them, have been coming to Pakistan. There are colonies in Pakistan called Burmese colonies. They're all Rohingya people living there. Not now, they, since they have been expelled and facing persecution and apartheid, they have been coming for years. About 500,000 of them are in Saudi Arabia. They were taken not in this 2017 genocide, but earlier waves of expulsion. And there are about 80,000 in Burma. The worst situation they have, unfortunately, is in Bangladesh. They're living like detention camps in Burma. They cannot get out. There's a barbed wire around. Bangladeshi barbed wire is far stronger than the Burmese barbed wire currently. They need a permit to get out. It was the same situation in Burma. They cannot hold a job. Actually, small shops, which I have noticed many times, which pop up, people selling things to each other among Rohingyas. There was economy being developed. Often they come and just destroy that. There are 500,000 Rohingya children. They are not allowed to go to school. Even schools, Rohingyas started because there are about 1,000 Rohingyas who are historically were teachers or somewhat educated. Their schools have been shut down. Officially, UNHCR and OIM, Organization of International Migration, both told me the same thing, that Bangladeshi government as a policy does not allow Rohingya to study beyond the 3rd grade. And in a more or less oblique way, the bureaucratic in charge of RRRC also confirmed the same thing to me. I went with a delegation and met the Bangladeshi Foreign Ministry. Secretary of Foreign Relations, right to him was sitting their ambassador to Burma, who was back in Bangladesh at that time, and about 10 of them. He was very clear, categorical, that we don't believe these people will ever go back. Now, Rohingyas and Bangladeshis, they agree on one thing. Rohingyas want to go back badly. Bangladeshi want them to go back. There's not enough pressure on Burma to force them back there. But my question is, Rohingyas, educated Rohingyas, are good for themselves. Good for Bangladesh is Bangladesh believe they will never go back. And if they ever go back, it is good for Burma. Why block education? 2 generations of Rohingyas are raised in Burma without education. Now there is a 3rd generation being raised without it. With these comments, Professor John, I would say that let's have some question and answers.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your comments. And Andrew, you will now take over and help us with the questions that are coming in.
All right. Thank you, everyone, for your presentations. This has been an amazing, amazing moment. So I'm really just overwhelmed to even be in the room. So we have a couple of questions here. If anyone does have any question, please put them into the Q&A module. This question is from Gwyneth Murphy. Gwyneth asks, are there any ways in which students or student groups can be in a unique position to bring attention to this cause? And what can we do to best support this issue, I'm assuming, as a student?
Can I answer a little bit?
Yes, ma'am.
I would, we work with the students. My request for students is twofold. OIM and UNHCR were very categorical about it, that unless there is a pressure on the Bangladeshi government, they will not allow education and they will not allow refugee status. Refugee status guarantees that they can have a job, freedom of movement, and things of this nature. United States is the only country which has given $1.6 billion, billion with B, for taking care of Rohingya refugees. No other country comes close to it. Next is Canada, given 300 million Canadian dollars. It is important, and students can have a writing campaign. Right to, I know Biden is pretty busy with many things, but his wife is an educator. First Lady, write letters to her to take up the cause of education for Rohingyas. So in a unique way, attention comes to these people who are suffering, as Dr. Lee mentioned, for a very long period of time. And now that genocide has provisionally recognized by ICJ, International Court of Justice, and United States. I mean, when I called it, it's a genocide in 2012, Amnesty International stopped my speech saying that it's not a genocide. It's a textbook case of genocide. Now that everybody accepts that it's a genocide, so what can survivors of genocide have right of survival? And education is primary. So if we get them education through enough pressure, I hope things will move forward. I will give out my email address, Malik, M-A-L-I-K, at soundvision.com. One word, soundvision.com. We have a student group in New York whom we regularly work, and every year they do a program. So we like to have a student movement focus on education of these people. I don't know any country where 3 generations of people have been denied education.
This is from Chris Wagner, a Jesuit scholar here at Georgetown. What are the cultural roots of the Rohingya people beyond the 1780s?
Dr. Lee?
Yeah, so I might just very quickly just echo those comments about the importance of engaging with public representatives. It's certainly something that I think is really important, and I can't sort of overemphasize how influential it can be for public representatives to receive letters about international issues and to see that people are interested in those issues. It's something that we sometimes think that they don't take an interest, but they do. I mean, they'll get every week, they'll get the list of what are the issues that have been raised with them as a concern. And that's certainly something that school groups could participate in. I think it's important to note that there's some quite active young Rohingya folk who are expressing themselves very publicly through poetry and through photography. And you can support their publications. It's a very practical thing that students can do. I think I've got some links on my on Twitter. They've got tweets, and you can see I've recently myself just bought a really lovely Rohingya photography book, photos taken by Rohingya in Bangladesh, and this is their way of expressing themselves. But there are Rohingya poets as well who are selling their books in, they're online. You can sort of find them, and it's their way of expressing themselves and communicating with the outside world, in a pretty dire circumstances for them. But that is something that I think is certainly a worthy thing to support. In terms of the long-term history of the Rohingya, Rohingya, you could say, come from a number of places. The common story you get told when you talk to Rohingya is that in about the 8th century there was a shipwreck of sailors in the northern Bay of Bengal, and that was what brought Islam and what started the Rohingya community. And that's certainly shipwrecks and trade were certainly one way that Islam came to that part of the northern Bay of Bengal, but also conversions in terms of the overland movement of Islam from Bengal into what is now Myanmar, and that really ended with the Arakan-Yoma mountain range, which separates Rakhine, Arakan from the flat plain, the Irrawaddy plains of the rest of central. The rest of central Myanmar. It's worth noting as well that there was a very active slave trade historically as well, and that slaves were brought from Bengal into Arakan, and then some would stay. The Arakanese king would have first choice as to who would stay, and then others would be potentially sold on to in fact, the Dutch in the Indies. There are British maps that you can see from the 1700s that describe parts of what is now modern Bangladesh that are described as depopulated because of the ravages of people from Arakan. So the Rohingya community is a community that historically has been created out of in a number of ways. There's no single way that you would say. It's not a community that's migrated from somewhere else en masse or anything like that. The point is correct that Islam was well established in Arakan, in the area that is Rakhine State, Myanmar, well before people came across the Arakan-Yoma from from other parts of Burma, from other parts of Myanmar. So before the arrival of the ancestors of the Buddhist communities that are in Rakhine, there was a well-established Muslim community there. So, I mean, any question about the Rohingya's heritage, I mean, this is an indigenous group, and it's very clear it's an indigenous group, and they should be given their rights as an indigenous group to live in safety on their ancestral homelands.
This question is for Imam Mujahid. This is from Mubashra from the Bridge Initiative. Imam, can you talk about the current conditions of and risks that Rohingya refugees face in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, and how the government there has moved thousands of refugees from Basan Char Island, despite warnings from rights activists that the island is vulnerable to flooding and deadly monsoons?
Well, situation is horrible. Just imagine any one of us living and eating the same thing over and over and over again. I mean, just that itself could become a torture. But they cannot buy anything. You know, there is no place to garden. These people used to raise their own food. They used to have their own fish. They cannot fish. They cannot buy things. They cannot sell things. So it's essentially a prison. In prison, you have a choice. The government is responsible coming up with different menus and all of that. Here, even that is not an option. It's a horrible condition. Fire, since the homes are just nothing but bamboo and plastic, they just catch fire. And that you just simply cannot stop, because in those, you're walking literally, sometime a small path, I walk like this, because this way you cannot walk, because everything is so close to each other, those tents and all that. This is not organized. I mean, people just put up these things as they were arriving, and bamboo and plastic. So when fire happened, they cannot run away. Many people die because there's a barbed wire out there. So they just cannot exit in that direction. And the other direction, barbed wire, is where there is a little ditch, little bit of water, and there is a road. So fire will go this way. So you want to run away from the other side. You cannot run away. Many people die like that. And law and order situation in there is such that Rohingya leaders, whoever comes to prominence, is simply murdered. Who murders them? Nobody knows about that. Murderers are never found. While the whole thing is essentially a military camp, which surrounds through barbed wire, inside people walking and things of this nature. That island where people are being taken also is a consideration on the part of Bangladesh that these people are not going to go back, so they need to be settled. Well, that's a good motive, except without education, settled in from one detention camp to essentially an island of prisons, that is not a solution. And most people have said this is not going to work. But Bangladeshis and now United Nations, which is always compliant to the government for collaboration and all that, is not speaking up as much as they should be speaking up. These people are human beings, treated inhumanely by Burmese. And now, unfortunately, Bangladesh have given them only one freedom. That's freedom to worship. I mean, when in 2017, when camps, they were coming, I could hear call for prayer all around me. So I said, oh, these people are very religious people. Well, that is true also, but at the same time, they were celebrating their freedom to pray. Because in Tholatuli, a village which I investigated very thoroughly, and the case is submitted to International Court of Criminal Court, in Tholatuli, there were 5 mosques. All 5 mosques are destroyed. There were 5 imams. only one Imam Abdul Ghaffur survived, who I interviewed in detail to learn about that. So since 2012 until 2017, they will not be allowed to pray in a mosque, although 3,500 people there, 3,000 were Muslim, 500 were Buddhist there, and they will have a school, they will not, and they will allow to worship. Muslim will not be allowed to worship. Even in home, if they're suspected of worshiping or teaching Quran or something, they will invade them. Unfortunately, that's the only freedom Rohingyas have in Bangladesh, that every block there is a same, mosque is made of the same bamboo and same plastic, and that's all. But that's not enough for a human being.
Andrew.
Yeah, we have definitely a lot of questions. So this question is a pretty important question. This is from David Eichert. David asks, and this is for anyone, what was the role of sexual violence in the genocide? And what do you think of prospects for justice for those crimes?
Well, I'm glad the rape is considered a war crime in International Book of Law, thanks to the Bosnia, where 50,000 Muslim women were raped. And I campaigned for it, and it is now part of international law. And some people, Serbs, are still being tried for the rapes which they committed. When we researched, our research was very different. We didn't ask women about what they raped. We have in the camps women coordinators who will take care of women's different needs and things like that. So we asked coordinators, how many women themselves volunteered about the sexual violence and rape towards them? Based on that, our estimate was that 25% of women volunteered the information that they have been subject to rape and violence. Then came the United Nations report. They say more than 50% of women either were raped, subject to sexual violence, because inserting a rod in somebody's vagina cannot be quite considered a rape, but sexual violence, or they saw someone being subject to that. And then the State Department of the United States said that they agreed with the finding of Rohingyas. So that has been substantial part of this thing. I asked one village that what happened in your village when you ran? They said nothing happened in our village. I asked them, why did they run? That village was, no military came, no attack came. Until then, no houses were burned down. Later on, they burned down the whole thing. So why did they run? They told me one thing, and that is sexual violence and rape against women. That we heard about that, it was happening from village to village, and they were coming closer to us. So we decided to leave before they do those things to us. And the term Muslim women use for that is term, Professor Esposito note that they call it zulm. When they are talking to you, they will say zulm was done to me. And zulm is a terminology from the Quran, but when they use that term, they mean just nothing but rape.
The next question we'll take here from Mayor Malik. Mayor says, which Muslim countries have been vocal about the crisis, and which majority Muslim countries have been silent or complicit in the workings of the Burmese state? How can other major majority Muslim countries pressure the Burmese army to stop this genocide?
Dr. Lee?
Well, everyone's been vocal to an extent. I mean, the problem in many respects is that the Rohingya have got too many words now. I mean, prior to 2017, very few people were talking about the Rohingya. Very few people were talking about their circumstances. Since then, they've had a lot of words from a lot of countries. I guess the point that the point that should be made is that Bangladesh, of course, has done a lot of the heavy lifting in terms of being they share a border with Myanmar. They in 2017 did accept over 1 million. Ultimately, there's over 1 million Rohingya refugees living within Bangladesh. I'm sitting here in London in the UK. I'm in a country where if 5 people in a dinghy try to cross the channel, the government sends the Navy to turn them back. So, Bangladesh, we should acknowledge that they have been at the forefront of this, but I think it's important to also acknowledge where stated beliefs and outcomes are not the same. And my argument would be that Bangladesh's stated views about what the policy outcomes that it wants with the Rohingya community are not consistent with the policies that it's applying within those camps. That if your desire is not to create a community of disenchanted and potentially criminalized young men, then you should educate them. Don't leave them sitting around bored with no sense of that they'll have any sort of future. Now, Bangladesh's view is that it says that it wants peaceful camps, and then ultimately people will return in time to, and hopefully quickly, to Myanmar. But achieving peaceful camps means giving people access to education. It also means not forcing them onto a prison island in Bhasan Char, a prison island in the Bay of Bengal. I see the statistics every week I track the statistics every week from the UN of drownings in the Rohingya community. Drownings. How is this a high cause of death among the Rohingya community? Well, it's people trying to leave places like Bhasan Char. This is horrible sort of stuff. In terms of Southeast Asia, at times we see some action or some strong words from Malaysia and Indonesia. Indonesia's foreign minister should be given some credit for the way that they've pushed ASEAN, but ASEAN's been pretty weak as an international body, and ultimately they should have done much more. There are arguments I think that can be made for how unwelcoming some of those countries have been to Rohingya refugees who have managed to make it to those places. Until very recently, Rohingya refugee children in Malaysia couldn't access schooling, and until I think last year that became something that was possible. And that shouldn't have been the case. It shouldn't have been the case that refugee children in Kuala Lumpur couldn't access schooling for their children because their parents were Rohingya refugees who've travelled there. I think there's also legitimate criticism to be made of the funding for the Rohingya refugees from Gulf countries. I think that's something that is often high on people's mind. The UN's call for funding is never fully funded when it comes to the refugees in Bangladesh. I don't think it's been fully funded once since 2017, and there is a legitimate concern among people that, I think it's a legitimate policy concern that if your primary concern is caring for people who share your religion, then you should prioritize their welfare and their humanitarian circumstances above purchasing sporting teams or hosting sporting events. And I think that's something that will become more of an issue in the coming months when people start to consider whether or not spending huge sums of money on sports events is a worthy, or whether that's more worthy than providing humanitarian assistance for communities like the Rohingya. I think as well, there needs to be some questions asked about, and I'm not going to name which countries have done this historically in this forum, but there needs to be some question about which countries have been willing to provide arms for Myanmar's military over the last 40 years. And I think that I think you can search yourselves to see who has been prepared to sell arms to Myanmar's military. These are not people who should be given weapons ever. And certainly these are not people who should have been given weapons after 2017. You know, we should not have a situation where ever a member of the OIC, a member state of the OIC, allows arms to be provided to Myanmar's military.
So this question is from Alexandra Lenon. So Alexandra asks, says, and this is for either speaker, Dr. Lee mentioned that while Aung San Suu Kyi was deciding which stance she would take on the genocide of Rohingya Muslims, there was an assumption that the majority of Myanmar condoned the military's actions. Was this assumption true, and has it remained consistent to today?
I'll jump in if you don't mind. No, the assumption was wrong. The assumption was, I think, completely wrong. I think that what we see, and we see this since the coup, the most recent coup, that people in Myanmar as a whole, their experience of the military is that the military are horrible, brutal, violent, genocidal lunatics who should not be in power in Myanmar or anywhere else. They should be in, I mean, they should be in jail. Min Aung Hlaing, the coup leader, should be taken to The Hague and put on trial for genocide, war crimes, and other crimes against humanity. And I don't think the majority of people in Myanmar endorsed the violent genocidal deportation of the Rohingya. How it was portrayed to them at the time was that there was terrorist activity within Rakhine State, and that the military was quelling it. And that's the message that ordinary people received. But Aung San Suu Kyi would have known better than that. She would have seen the briefings, and she would have, quite frankly, been able to see the international media reports that all of us were able to see. She would have either been reading them herself, or she would have had advisors that were reading them and seeing them, because she had a Facebook page too. She had access to the internet. She would have known what was going on, and she didn't call for restraint at all. And that's the key issue, I think. I don't think that she needed to think. She shouldn't have needed to think for any minute about what to do. It was very clear very quickly what the military were doing. Were undertaking a scorched earth campaign. They call it a clearance operation. I mean, this is something that it's a sort of a euphemism for scorched earth campaign, and we've seen it throughout Myanmar. It's the sort of thing. It's based on a military doctrine of the Myanmar military called 4 Cuts, which is designed to take away the opponent's access to recruits and intelligence and funding, so that all of those things are taken away. But by its nature, it targets the civilian communities, and it's targeted civilian communities since the 1960s. So, you know, if you're a policymaker in Myanmar, if the military says we're undertaking a clearance operation, that means scorched earth. And you can see it on news reports from throughout Myanmar today, last week, and you'll see it next week, that when the military says it's undertaking a clearance operation, it targets civilians, it burns their homes, and it considers that to be a successfully completed clearance operation. Now, they did it to the Rohingya community with both the desire to undertake a clearance operation and with genocidal intent, whereas in the rest of the country, you could argue that they're doing very similar crimes, but their intention is to quell opposition to their coup rather than genocidally deport people from the country. So motivation is important when it comes to how we consider genocide, and particularly under the Genocide Convention. Motivation is incredibly is central to whether you can successfully prosecute under the Genocide Convention. It's the genocidal intent is the key thing. But no, I think Aung San Suu Kyi got this wrong, and I think that the people of Myanmar are now suffering the consequences of that, and the Rohingya suffered the consequences of it in 2017.
Imam Majid, just a quick question for me, and it may be an unfair one. My sense when I look both at the Rohingya situation and the Uyghur situation is that it is astonishing how silent some of the Muslim world have been, countries and organizations. There's almost, at times, it seems almost a symmetry there, but I may be missing something.
Yeah, I mean, on Uyghur issue, you see the Muslim world and as the countries started becoming independent 50, 60 years ago, they were used to playing between the Soviet Union and America. And there was some room. After 9/11, US have been dictating almost everything, including the curriculum. I mean, curriculum of Saudi Arabia has been revised 3 times. So many other, so they're looking for a play for their life. And they see China, this is all, I mean, I need to write a thesis to for all of that to be accurate, provide evidence to this, but I think that's what is happening. So with China, they do a silent conversation. Different countries, especially Pakistan, has gotten Pakistanis who are married to Uyghur women, they got Uyghur women released, silent conversation. But publicly, they try to avoid, we have seen. In terms of Rohingyas, I think they have been pretty vocal. I mean, Turkish First Lady played a major role in humanizing Rohingyas, showing up in Burma herself. And under the leadership of Bangladesh, a group of 5 OIC countries under OIC auspices was established around to help Gambia file the case. It took them a couple of years. And they have been taking care of Rohingya refugees, not as well as they should. I think in Europe, when I did a conference on Rohingyas in Norway, Oslo, where they give out the Nobel Peace Prizes in that institute, I invited all the Rohingya leaders. I was surprised to find they were all talking to me in Urdu. I said, how do you know Urdu? They said, well, except one, all of them went to Pakistan, became Pakistani citizens, got their passports, learned the languages, and then they moved to Europe, and that's how they are different country leaders. But that facility to become refugees, to get education, and become citizen has not been available to them in Malaysia or in Indonesia or in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia especially has a large number. A 3rd generation of Rohingyas are there, but they are not citizen, but permanent residents. And the recent arrivals. So in Rohingya case, they are not fighting a superpower, more or less. So vocal and showing up that they are active on that case. But when it comes to Uyghur issues, although Uyghur issue is as old of freedom, justice, and Islam as I would say Palestine issue or the Kashmir issue. But they will be vocal somewhat on Palestine, more or less silent on Kashmir issue, but absolutely supportive of China, what happens there. And it plays a role. I mean, China is amazing. When I visited, I'm an eyewitness to genocide there, but in my rooms, there will be a copy of the Quran in hotels. In the middle of the road, they will stop me and talk something nice about Islam. And these communists can arrange these things for you. And some of these people have actually been duped into thinking, well, there is not much of a problem. But China is changing now. The policies which they have about the Uyghur people, now they're applying to rest of the Chinese Muslims, where they used to have a level of freedom. They're losing one by one those freedoms.
Well, sadly, we're out of time, but I want to thank both Dr. Lee and Imam Majid for a fantastic program. It's been extraordinarily substantive, and we're very grateful that you spent this time with us. And I'd like to thank all of those that have been following, and please feel free to get in touch with us if you have any questions or interest. Also, go to the Bridge website, bridge.georgetown.edu, and you'll find data there and articles that you will find relevant and of interest. So, Imam Majid.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, John, for organizing this. And good to hear Dr. Lee. And thank you, Mubashir, and all of you. And if you want to get involved in helping Rohingya people, go to Burma Task Force. That's the name for the website, burmataskforce.org, and you will get more information and participation. We have bill in the Congress as well.
And I should mention that Dr. Lee has written an incredible chapter for a book that Oxford will be publishing that I and Saha Aziz have done on global Islamophobia and the rise of populism. So I want to thank everybody that's joined us today and hope to see some of you in the near future. Take care.